October 1974, Harlan County, Kentucky. The air had a metallic taste, a new flavor layered over the old smells of damp earth and curing tobacco. It was the scent of progress, or so everyone said. It came from the Allied Chemical and Plastics plant, a sprawling complex of beige metal buildings and gleaming silver towers that had risen from the valley floor in less than 18 months. The plant sat on 300 acres of the flattest land in the county, land that had been sold by the county itself for a price that was considered both a bargain and a blessing. Silas Blackwood watched the steam rise from the tallest of the plant stacks from the porch of his farmhouse. He was 72 years old, a man whose joints ached with the memory of every season he had ever worked. His house stood on a rise of land, a small island of high ground that overlooked the valley and the new factory that now dominated it. His family had farmed this same rise and the slopes below it since 1888. The deed, signed in a spidery script, was in a tin box in his desk. He was the fourth Blackwood to work this soil. He would be the last. The problem was not the factory itself. Silas was not a man who stood against the turning of the world. He understood the need for jobs, the pull of a weekly wage that farming could no longer reliably provide. The problem was the water. It was always the water. The factory had been built on what locals had forever called the sinking meadow, a wide, low floodplain for the Cumberland River and the smaller tributary, Briar Creek, which snaked its way through the valley. The company's engineers had assured everyone they had solved the water. They had dredged a new, deeper channel for Briar Creek, straightened its lazy curves, and lined its banks with riprap stone. They had built a series of concrete discharge canals to carry treated wastewater from the plant back into the creek, a system they described in the local paper as state-of-the-art. For generations, the sinking meadow had been a place of accepted defeat. Farmers had tried to drain it, tried to dike it, tried to tame it. Every attempt had failed. After a week of heavy spring rain, the entire valley floor would become a shallow, slow-moving lake. The water would sit for weeks, ruining crops, drowning pasture. Eventually, everyone had given up. The land was used for rough grazing in the dry months and abandoned to the river in the wet ones. The county was happy to sell it to Allied Chemical, glad to be rid of a perennial problem and grateful for the tax revenue. The factory, everyone agreed, had finally done what no farmer could. It had conquered the sinking meadow. Richard Sterling was the plant manager for Allied Chemical and Plastics. He was 38, with a sharp suit, a sharper haircut, and an MBA from a university Silas had never heard of. He saw the world as a series of inputs and outputs, of efficiencies to be maximized and problems to be engineered away. He was confident, articulate, and utterly certain of the superiority of his methods. He drove a new Ford LTD, and the dust of the county roads seemed afraid to settle on its polished paint. In the first month of the plant's full operation, Sterling hosted a small open house for local officials and landowners. He stood before a large topographical map of the valley, a pointer in his hand. "Our hydrology team performed an exhaustive 18-month study," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty warehouse space. "We've calculated the 100-year floodplain, accounted for soil porosity, and engineered a drainage solution that not only protects our facility, but will, in fact, improve drainage for the entire valley." He pointed to the thick blue line that represented the newly straightened Briar Creek. "This is the key. By increasing the channel's depth and velocity, we've created a permanent, low-pressure zone that will draw groundwater away from the surrounding fields." He smiled, a flash of white teeth. "We've solved the problem that has plagued this county for over a century." Silas attended the meeting. He stood at the back, his old work coat smelling faintly of earth and motor oil. He did not speak. He listened. He watched the pointer trace the neat lines on the map, lines that bore little resemblance to the way he had seen the water move across that land for 70 years. After the presentation, Sterling mingled. He saw Silas looking at the map and strode over, hand extended. "Richard Sterling, glad you could make it." "Silas Blackwood," Silas said, his grip firm but dry. "My place is up on the rise yonder." He nodded toward the window. "Ah, yes. The old Blackwood farm," Sterling said, his smile becoming slightly condescending. A piece of local history. He looked from Silas's weathered face to the map. Quite a view you must have of our facility. The very picture of the old meeting the new. Silas just nodded. You put a lot of faith in that new ditch, he said, his voice quiet. Sterling laughed, a short, sharp sound. It's a bit more than a ditch, Mr. Blackwood. It's a feat of modern civil engineering. The calculations are precise. The water will go where we tell it to go. He clapped Silas on the shoulder. Don't you worry. Your land is safer from flooding now than it has ever been. Sterling then turned to greet the county judge, leaving Silas alone with the map. The following week, Silas Blackwood did something that made him the primary topic of conversation at the Harlan County Co-op. He went to the courthouse and, using the money he had saved over a lifetime of frugal living, he bought the land surrounding the new Allied chemical plant. There were parcels that hadn't been included in the factory's purchase, odd-shaped strips of bog and wetland that followed the old, meandering path of Briar Creek. They were considered utterly worthless. He acquired a total of 112 acres of cattails, swamp maple, and mud. The purchase price was little more than the cost of the back taxes owed on the properties. At the co-op, the men sitting on overturned buckets by the wood stove shook their heads. Heard about Silas? One would say. Paid good money for the sinking meadows leftovers. His father, Abe, was a sharp man. But Silas, maybe the sun's got to him in his old age, another would add. What in God's name is he going to do with it? You can't farm it. Can't build on it. Maybe he just likes the view of the factory. Someone joked, and they all laughed. The consensus was that Old Man Blackwood had finally slipped a gear. It was a sad thing. A man who had been so careful his whole life, throwing his money away on a sentimental whim. Richard Sterling heard the news from one of his foremen. He chuckled as he reviewed production spreadsheets in his clean, quiet office. The old man bought the swamp around us, he asked, not looking up. Good for him. Sentimental value, I suppose. Wants to keep a piece of the way things were. To Sterling, it was a quaint, foolish gesture. An old farmer, unable to accept the future, clinging to a patch of mud. It confirmed his every prejudice about the local population. They were backward, ruled by emotion, and incapable of understanding the clean, hard logic of progress. He dismissed it from his mind. It was an irrelevant variable. Silas did not care what they said at the co-op. He did not care what the man in the sharp suit thought. He had not bought the land out of sentiment. He had bought it because he remembered a day in the spring of 1918 when he was 6 years old. He had been walking with his father, Abe, across that same valley floor. The ground was spongy, and the air was thick with the smell of new life and decay. Abe Blackwood was a man who spoke little, but when he did, his words had the weight of stone. He carried a notebook and a pencil with him everywhere. He was not a schooled man, but he was a learned one. His university had been the land itself. On that day, he stopped and pointed with his walking stick at a shallow depression, barely visible in the long grass. You see that, son? He'd asked. Silas had squinted, seeing nothing but a dip in the ground. That's a ghost. A ghost. Silas had been old enough to know better, but his father's seriousness made him pause. A ghost of the creek, Abe had explained. He walked along the depression, his boots sinking slightly deeper than they did on the surrounding ground. Briar Creek, the one you see today, it's just the water's newest idea. But this whole valley, this is its old workshop. It's tried 1,000 different paths to the river, left its mark all over. They ain't gone. They're just sleeping. Abe had taken his son to the highest point on their farm, the place where the house now stood. He had unrolled a piece of canvas, a map he had drawn himself over many years. It was covered in lines, a thick one for the current creek, and dozens of finer, fainter lines, weaving and braiding their way across the valley. The men with their paper maps from the state, they draw the one creek and think they've drawn the water, Abe had said, his finger tracing one of the faint lines. They're wrong. They've only drawn the water's habit. In a dry year, it stays in its habit. But in a wet year, in a flood, the water remembers. It wakes up all its old ghosts. The whole valley floor becomes the river. Then Abe Blackwood had delivered the principle that had guided Silas's life. He tapped the canvas map, his knuckle landing on the web of faint lines. They think that creek is the only river here, son. But the real river is the whole valley floor. You can't dam the valley. You can't force it. The water is stronger and more patient than any man. You don't fight it. You guide it. And whoever understands the low ground, whoever guides the water, guides everything that depends on it. That knowledge was Silas's inheritance. It was more valuable than the land itself. After his father died, Silas kept the maps. He kept the notebooks, filled with his father's precise, dated observations of rainfall, flood levels, and soil conditions. And he added his own. For 50 years, he had walked the sinking meadow, updating the maps, noting how the cattails grew thickest in the old channels, how the ground stayed wet longest in the ancient bends. He had a record, a physical manifestation of knowledge that went deeper than any engineering study conducted over a mere 18 months. The Allied chemical engineers had seen a single creek. Silas and his father had seen a braided stream, a complex system of interconnected waterways waiting for the right conditions to reawaken. The company had bought the high ground of the floodplain. Silas had just bought the ghosts. For 3 years, the factory operated without a major incident. The new channel for Briar Creek seemed to work. The seasons were mild, with average rainfall. The men at the co-op stopped talking about Silas's foolish purchase. It became an accepted piece of local lore, a testament to the eccentricity of old age. Richard Sterling's star rose at Allied Chemical. Production was up. Costs were down. His solution for the sinking meadow was a success story he mentioned in every report to corporate headquarters. Silas waited. He paid the small property tax bill on his 112 acres of swamp each year. He watched the seasons. He read the farmer's almanac. He studied the long-range weather patterns. In the fall of 1977, he saw what he was waiting for. The signs were there: a wet autumn, a deep snowpack in the mountains to the east, and the prediction of a long, rainy spring. The 800-year flood wasn't a statistical abstraction to Silas. It was a debt the land owed the river, and he felt it was about to be paid. He did not write a letter to the factory. He did not warn the county. He did not seek anyone's approval. One cold morning in late March of 1978, he went to his barn. He opened the wide doors, and the smell of old grease and settled dust filled the air. He walked past his newer, more reliable John Deere tractor to the machine tucked in the back corner. It was a 1953 Ford Jubilee, his father's last tractor. It was small and antiquated, but Silas had maintained it perfectly. Bolted to its rear was a Woods Model 750 backhoe attachment, just as old as the tractor, but just as ready. He checked the oil and the hydraulic fluid. He filled the gas tank from a red can. He climbed onto the cracked vinyl seat, pulled the choke, and turned the key. The engine turned over slowly, then caught with a puff of blue smoke and settled into a familiar, sputtering idle. Silas let it warm up, the sound a low rumble in the quiet morning. His plan was simple. His tools were old. The work would be slow. He drove the Jubilee down the slope from his farm, its tires leaving deep tracks in the soft ground. He crossed the county road and unlocked the gate to his own worthless land. He rumbled out onto the edge of the sinking meadow, the factory a silent, beige behemoth in the distance. He carried no blueprints, no laser levels. His only guides were a handful of Osage orange stakes he had cut himself, his father's hand-drawn map, protected in a folded piece of oilcloth, and the knowledge in his head. He did not start digging near the factory's discharge canal. He started nearly half a mile away, on the far side of his property, at the lowest point of the land he now owned. He consulted the map, then walked in a gentle curve, his eyes on the subtle changes in vegetation and the feel of the ground beneath his boots. He hammered in the first stake. He walked another 50 feet and hammered in a second. He spent the entire morning laying out a path, a shallow, winding course that followed one of the faintest lines on his father's map, the ghost of a channel that hadn't seen a real current in a century. In the afternoon, he began to dig. The work was methodical, painstaking. He would lower the backhoe bucket, scrape away a few inches of black, peaty topsoil, and deposit it neatly to the side. He was not digging a deep ditch like the one the factory had made. He was sculpting a shallow swale, no more than 18 inches deep and perhaps 4 feet wide. A gentle depression. The math did not require a pencil. He knew the elevation of the land where he started and the elevation of Briar Creek downstream. He needed to create a consistent, almost imperceptible slope, a fall of 1 foot for every 500 feet of length. He worked for a week on that first swale. Every day, the Jubilee would chug its way out into the meadow. The factory workers on their shift changes would see the old man on his little tractor digging what looked like a meandering, pointless trench. Some of them pointed and laughed. Richard Sterling saw him, too. He was driving out to inspect the main discharge canal when he noticed the distant tractor. He stopped his LTD and watched for a moment, a bemused smile on his face. "What's he doing?" his plant engineer, a young man named Bill, asked from the passenger seat. "Landscaping, apparently," Sterling said with a dry chuckle. "Probably thinks he can drain the swamp with a garden hoe. Let the old man have his fun. It keeps him busy." He put the car in drive and continued on his way, the image of the tiny tractor already fading from his mind. The incident became a running joke among the plant's management team. They called Silas the Beaver, the old man who was building a dam to nowhere. Silas was not building a dam. He was doing the opposite. He was creating an invitation. When he finished the first swale, which was nearly a quarter-mile long, he started on a second, branching off from the first. Then a third. He worked through April as the predicted rains began to fall. The ground grew softer and the work grew harder. The Jubilee, with its narrow tires, sometimes bogged down in the mud, and Silas would have to use the backhoe bucket to push or pull himself free. He was reawakening the braided stream. Each swale he dug was a resurrection of an ancient, forgotten water path. They were not connected to the factory's discharge canal. Not yet. They were simply a network of empty, waiting channels on his own land, all sloping gently, patiently, toward the lowest point of the valley and eventually to Briar Creek, far downstream from the factory's outfall. He was creating a system that was wider, shallower, and had a more appealing gradient than the deep, narrow, and artificially straight channel the engineers had built. He was offering the water a better path, a path of least resistance. The course at the co-op had new material. Silas is still out there, digging in the rain. Seen him myself. Looks like a dog burying 100 bones. Somebody ought to check on him. A man his age, out in this weather. It ain't right. He's not crazy. One of the older farmers, a man who remembered Abe Blackwood, said quietly. He's just patient, but he was a lone voice. The consensus remained that Silas was engaged in a massive, muddy folly. By the first week of May, the rains had become relentless. It was not a series of thunderstorms, but a steady, soaking deluge that lasted for days on end. The Cumberland River began to swell, its muddy water climbing its banks. The ground in the valley became completely saturated. Small ponds appeared in fields where they had never been before. The sinking meadow began to live up to its name. This was the first real test of Allied Chemicals' state-of-the-art drainage system. For the first few days, it seemed to be working. The big concrete canal carried a torrent of brown water from the plants, settling ponds into the raging Briar Creek. Richard Sterling felt a surge of pride. His engineers had been right. They had beaten the valley. Then, on the fourth day of continuous rain, the first sign appeared. It was subtle. A report from the wastewater treatment supervisor noted that the flow meter at the discharge point was showing a slight decrease in velocity, even though the pumps were working at full capacity. The water level in the canal, which should have been dropping as it raced toward the creek, was holding steady. Silas saw it from his porch. He sat in his rocking chair, a cup of coffee in his hand, and watched the valley through his father's old binoculars. He did not look at the factory's canal. He looked at his own land. The shallow swales he had dug were no longer empty. They were full, carrying sheets of clear, clean groundwater that had been squeezed out of the saturated soil. They were working exactly as he had planned, pulling the high water table of the surrounding meadow down and channeling it away. His network was alive. The next day, the problem at the factory was no longer subtle. The water level in the main discharge canal was visibly higher. The flow had become sluggish, almost stagnant. The water wasn't moving away fast enough. It was backing up. Sterling called an emergency meeting with his engineering team. They looked at blueprints and flowcharts. They blamed the flood stage of Briar Creek, arguing that the high water level was preventing their canal from emptying properly. "It's a bottleneck at the confluence," the lead engineer insisted. "Once the creek level drops, the system will clear itself." Sterling wanted to believe him, but a knot of unease was tightening in his stomach. He drove out to the fence line himself, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud. He looked at his canal. The water was brown and still, lapping at the top of the concrete walls. It was a failing system. Then he looked across the fence, on a Silas Blackwood's property. He could not believe what he saw. 100 yards away, water was moving. It was flowing swiftly and cleanly through a dozen interconnected shallow channels. It was as if the old man had laid down a parallel river, a river that was working while his own expensive engineered canal was choking. He saw that the ground on Silas's side of the fence seemed drier, less inundated than the ground on the factory side. The old man's foolish ditches were pulling water not just from his own land, but from the land around it. They were pulling the water right out from under the factory's foundations. The principle was one his own engineers should have understood. Water does not care about property lines. It only cares about gravity and pressure. Silas had created a massive, low-pressure zone on his land. The saturated ground under the factory, including the ground through which their own discharge canal ran, was a high-pressure zone. The water, following the fundamental laws of physics, was leaving the factory's stagnant ditch, seeping through the soil, and flowing toward the more efficient drainage system Silas had built next door. He hadn't blocked their outfall. He had starved it. He had stolen its water. The climax came 24 hours later. The water in the discharge canal had backed up so far that it was beginning to flood the factory's wastewater settling ponds. Alarms began to sound. If the ponds overflowed, untreated chemical waste would spill into the valley. It was an environmental disaster in the making, a public relations nightmare that would cost the company millions. Sterling had no choice. He gave the order to begin a systematic shutdown of production lines 1, 2, and 3. The plant, for the first time in its history, was being defeated by the sinking meadow. The quantification of the failure was brutal and swift. The shutdown was costing Allied Chemical and Plastics $50,000 an hour in lost production. The emergency measures, including bringing in tanker trucks to pump out the settling ponds, added thousands more to the cost. The entire capital investment in the drainage system, over $2 million in 1974 money, was now worthless. All of this was happening because a 72-year-old man in a 20-year-old tractor had spent a month digging shallow ditches in a swamp he had bought for less than the price of Richard Sterling's company car. The irony was as deep and suffocating as the water that was now threatening to drown his career. The rain finally stopped on the 7th day. The sky cleared to a pale, washed-out blue, but the water did not recede. The factory remained crippled, operating at less than a quarter of its capacity. The discharge canal was a long, stagnant pond. Sterling's engineers were useless. Their models hadn't accounted for this. Their spreadsheets had no column for a man with a generational knowledge of ghosts. There was only one thing left to do. After a sleepless night and a tense phone call with a furious vice president in Chicago, Richard Sterling got into his car. He didn't drive toward the plant. He drove down the county road and turned up the long, muddy lane that led to the Blackwood farm. He parked his pristine LTD next to Silas's rusting pickup truck. He took a deep breath, the air clean and sharp after the rain. Then he stepped out, his polished leather shoes sinking immediately into the soft, damp earth. The mud clung to them, a piece of the valley claiming its due. He walked to the farmhouse and saw Silas sitting on the porch, not in the rocking chair, but on the top step, cleaning a piece of machinery with an oily rag. The old Ford Jubilee was parked nearby, its backhoe arm resting on the ground like a tired limb. It was spattered with mud from its tires to the top of its engine cowling. It looked triumphant. Silas looked up as Sterling approached. He did not smile. He did not seem surprised. He simply watched the man from the factory make his slow, undignified way across the yard. Sterling stopped a few feet from the steps, a man in a suit standing in a puddle, his authority washed away by the flood. "Mr. Blackwood," Sterling began, his voice hoarse. He had prepared a speech, a negotiation strategy. But looking at the quiet, steady gaze of the old man, the words fell hollow and foolish. He abandoned the script. "I was wrong," he said. The admission cost him more than he could have imagined, yet it felt like the first true thing he had said in a week. "I don't fully understand what you did, but you stopped us. The system our engineers designed, it's failed. And yours is working." Silas finished, wiping the grease from the hydraulic fitting in his hand. He set it down carefully on a clean section of the porch. He looked out over the valley, at the glint of the sun on the water that now flowed through his land. "The water didn't fail," he said, his voice calm and even. "It just did what water does. It went where it was easiest to go. You tried to force it into a box. I gave it back its old bed." He stood up, his joints protesting with a quiet groan, and walked into the house. He returned a moment later with the oilcloth bundle. He carefully unrolled it on the porch railing, revealing the hand-drawn map. It was yellowed with age, stained with dirt and time. He also brought out one of the notebooks, its cover soft with use. He opened it to a page of his father's script. "My father taught me this valley," Silas said. He wasn't gloating. He was teaching. It was the tone of a man explaining a fact, like the sun rising in the east. "Your engineers, they looked at the ground as it is today. They saw one creek. They didn't see the memory in the land. His finger, thick and calloused, traced the faint, braided lines on the map. All these are old channels. The water cut them 1,000 years ago. The soil in them is different. More sand and gravel. It drains faster. The plants that grow there are different. All I did was uncover them. Scraped off the top few inches of silt that had filled them in over the years." He pointed toward the factory. "Your canal is deep with steep sides. You dug it through heavy clay. You made a hard path for the water. And you made it straight. Water doesn't like to run straight. It likes to meander. It slows it down, gives it time to sink in. All that water from the rain, it saturated the whole valley. The ground got heavy. It wanted to get rid of that water. Your ditch was too slow, too difficult. My swales," he gestured to his own land, "they're shallow, with a perfect, gentle slope. They're wider. They offer more surface area. They follow the land's own memory. The water found it easier to seep through 100 yards of soil to get to my channels than it was to fight its way down your concrete box." Sterling stared at the map, then at the land. For the first time, he was not seeing a problem to be solved, but a system to be understood. The old man hadn't built a weapon. He had conducted an orchestra. He had simply read the score that had been written on the land for centuries and brought it back to life. "What do you want?" Sterling asked, his voice now quiet, respectful. "To let us connect our discharge to your system? We'll pay you, of course. Name your price." Silas shook his head slowly. "It's not about money. I don't want your money." He folded the map carefully. "This was never about stopping you. It was about making you see. You can't own the water. You can't command it. You can only ask it politely to go where you want it to go. And to do that, you have to understand its nature." He looked directly at Sterling. "I want you to fix it properly. I'll show your engineers the old maps. We'll design a new system together. Not one big ditch, but a network of swales and retention ponds spread out over my land and yours. A living system that works with the valley, not against it. You will pay for its construction. You will place a permanent conservation easement on my 112 acres, protecting it forever. And you will fund a scholarship at the state university in my father's name, the Abraham Blackwood Scholarship, for students from this county who want to study soil science and hydrology." Sterling was stunned. The old man wasn't asking for a payoff. He was asking for a permanent solution. He was asking for the knowledge to be respected and passed on. It was a more profound defeat and a more honorable one than simply writing a check. I'll have to run it by corporate," he stammered. "You do that," Silas said, picking up his rag again. "Your factory will stay shut down until they agree." The conversation was over. It took 2 weeks, but the corporation in Chicago, faced with the prospect of a multi-million-dollar redesign of their own or a continued, costly shutdown, finally agreed to all of Silas's terms. The official report that Richard Sterling had to write was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism, but the truth of it was unmistakable. He had to explain that the plant's critical infrastructure had been rendered inert by an elderly farmer's application of ancestral hydrogeological knowledge and minimalist earth-moving techniques. That summer, a new kind of work began in the sinking meadow. The company brought in modern earth-moving equipment, but the men operating it did not follow blueprints from an office in Chicago. They followed the guidance of an old man who walked ahead of them, pointing out the invisible paths and contours of the land. They filled in much of the single, deep canal. They sculpted a wide, shallow floodplain filled with meandering swales, native grasses, and small ponds. They worked with Silas, and they worked with a young woman from the county extension office, an agricultural engineer named Eleanor Vance, who had heard the story and had come to see for herself. Eleanor was the first person to look at Abe Blackwood's notebooks, not as a curiosity, but as a priceless dataset. She spent hours with Silas, meticulously transcribing the handwritten notes, correlating them with modern soil maps and rainfall data. She understood. She was the successor Silas hadn't known he was looking for. She became the bridge between his father's knowledge and the language of modern science. She helped design the new system, ensuring it met both the factory's needs and the land's nature. The old Ford Jubilee tractor sat parked in Silas's barn. Its work was done. It became a symbol, a quiet testament to the idea that the right tool was not always the newest or the biggest. Sometimes it was just the one that was held in a knowing hand. The notebooks, once Silas was satisfied that Eleanor understood their contents, were passed to her. He knew she would preserve them, that the knowledge would not die with him. The new drainage system became the new normal. It was beautiful, a green and living part of the valley that teemed with birds and other wildlife. It handled the spring rains without effort. The factory was able to operate at full capacity, its water problems solved permanently. Richard Sterling remained the plant manager, but he was a changed man. He was quieter, more observant. He learned the names of the trees on the property. He would sometimes walk the network of swales, no longer seeing them as a drainage system, but as a river with 1,000 memories. The story of what happened became a quiet legend in Harlan County, a piece of local lore that was no longer about a foolish old man, but about a wise one. It was no longer remarkable. It was simply true. Years later, after Silas had passed away, Eleanor Vance, by then a respected professor at the state university, would bring her hydrology students to the valley. She would show them the sophisticated, natural drainage system and the thriving industrial plant it supported. She would unroll a careful copy she had made of A. Blackwood's map, and she would tell them a story. And she would end her lecture with the same words, the final thematic statement that concluded every visit. Some knowledge doesn't get old or outdated, she would say, her voice carrying on the breeze that swept across the sinking meadow. It just waits. It waits for us to become quiet enough to listen to what the land has always been telling us.